Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the NY Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Loudville, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The NY Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrence and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kris Osborn. This is NucleCast and our second inaugural in a future series which covers cutting-edge innovations and technologies as they pertain to the broader questions of strategic deterrence and nuclear weapons in particular. We have an honorable guest today that is so excellent, has so many credentials, I could spend the whole time listing them. Captain William Ostendorff. Thank you so much, Captain. You got to remember your Navy title here, right? Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kris. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, let's make sure we cite a couple of your very important titles. You're with the board managers of the National Technology of Engineering Solutions at Sandia, the laboratory. You are also the co-chair, this one really caught my attention, co-chair Committee of Risk of Nuclear War and Nuclear Terrorism, the National Academy of Sciences. You also were the principal deputy administrator of the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration. As well, not to be left out, you've also been on the Hill. You were the director of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. So how do you get all that straight? That's quite a purview, Captain.
I've been very lucky and fortunate to have opportunities to use my nuclear background for the nuclear Navy under Rickover, and it's been a real privilege.
Well, it's an honor to have you, and certainly many are likely to appreciate your service to this country. We like to talk to great Americans, and you are one, which reminds me we're not going to leave out your submariner days as a Navy captain. Tell me about your submarines experience.
Yeah, well, I entered the Naval Academy in the early 70s and graduated in 76. Quickly went into the Rickover nuclear training program after graduation and went straight after that year program to a ballistic missile submarine, USS George Bancroft, one of the 41 for Freedom ballistic missile submarines we had during that time period. Then I went on after that to serve on 5 attack submarines, or SSNs. I had the privilege to command the USS Norfolk, a Los Angeles class attack submarine, for 3 years, from 1992 to 1995. I went on as in charge of submarine commanding officer training for a couple of years after that, followed by time as a submarine squadron commander for Submarine Squadron 6 in Norfolk, where I had 8 submarines and a dry dock under my command. So most of the 80s and 90s I was at sea, 16 years of sea duty. Had a great experience. Felt very fortunate to go to seas with great officers and enlisted personnel doing missions around the world. It was a great experience.
I've heard of the 41 for Freedom, and sure enough, the deep, dark depths of the undersea are familiar territory for you. Well, let's get right to our S&T focus, because this is obviously right up your alley. Gosh, we could talk for hours about this, but let's start by talking broadly in a technical sense, because we're thinking S&T about warhead modernization. Number one, how important that is that? Number two, what are some of the implications? And number three, to the extent possible, what are some of the technological adaptations?
Sure, and this is an area of critical importance to the United States and its security and its allies. Many secretaries of defense, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said the most important mission for the Department of Defense is nuclear deterrence. And I subscribe to that philosophy. Our whole existence during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and now during a time period of intense competition with not just the Soviet Union, as it has modernized its stockpile, but also that of China, that has rapidly increased the size of its stockpile, nuclear stockpile, has modernized its weapons, and we still have nuclear weapons threats from North Korea and Iran. And so I think that the environment today, Kris, is far more complex than was the bipolar world of the Cold War when I started out my submarine service time period. So it's important, in order for this nuclear deterrent to actually deter, it has to be credible and reliable. And at the end of the Cold War, early 1992 time period, President George H.W. Bush proposed and entered into a moratorium on nuclear explosive testing. We had at that time run about 1,000 tests out of the Nevada test site. So 1992 was the last test. And so when that testing ended, the key method to ensure that we had confidence and reliability that our nuclear weapons would work when required to work and authorized, and would not work when, let's say, seized by a terrorist, that required a very significant investment by the United States in what is called the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which has the underpinning science and engineering programs to assess the reliability and safety of the nuclear stockpile every year. So each year, the laboratory directors at Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, and Sandia National Laboratory submit a letter to the head of the National Nuclear Security Administration, on to the Secretary of Energy and Secretary of Defense, basically stating their lab directors' collective view as to whether or not the existing stockpile is reliable and safe in the absence of nuclear testing. And it's a true testament to the achievements of the Stockpile Stewardship Program that so far we know much more today about nuclear weapons than we did during the time period when we were actually testing them. The science of basically using high-speed computers to model at the atomic level the nuclear interactions of fission and fusion. And it's remarkable to see how these high-speed computers have taken off and what they can provide for the country. There's one of them I want to mention in particular, the El Capitan computer that is at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. That is today the fastest supercomputer in the world.
Wow. This is something to pick up on, this computing speed and processing power. We can only begin to imagine in terms of a technical sense how much that is changing, not just command and control, but as you said, the science of warheads themselves. And that calls to mind something I wanted to ask you about along those lines, which is we're going to take up some of the specific adaptations, but warhead modernization is in large measure, I would imagine, intended to counter countermeasures to a degree. For example, if enemies or potential adversaries have more advanced missile defense systems, more advanced defenses, then warheads can be adapted to essentially adapt to that situation and essentially counter the counter. What kinds of innovations address those kinds of tactical requirements?
Well, I think there's been a lot of work done on advancing radar systems, which are necessary for some of our nuclear warheads. And Sandia Lab has a very prominent role to play in the development of radar systems that support the stockpile. A lot of the work associated with countermeasures that you're mentioning is really important. We can't really get into it in this forum because of classification concerns. But I'd say that we know so much more today about warheads and delivery system performance because of the use of modeling and simulation tools. And that's been really a credit to the scientists and engineers throughout the entire NNSA and DoD complex that they've been able to muster these qualifications and conduct these tests in a way that gives us confidence that these weapons will work in the tough environment they're going to be anticipated to be in.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because actually it calls to mind the question of digital engineering. I recall being at a media event, and the former AE, the Air Force Acquisition Executive, Mr. Roper, talked about digital engineering with respect to the Sentinel, which at the time might have been the GBSD. And one of the things he mentioned was that, sure enough, you could assess the performance parameters of a variety of different design models without having to so-called, quote, bend metal, to use the cliche. So you massively streamline the developmental process. And now, in terms of the Sentinel, there's additional digital engineering going on. Northrop is taking a look at how best to further optimize that weapon system. So let's talk a little bit about that. And you touched on it a bit. How can digital engineering and computer simulation and modeling with some of these high-speed computers, how can they improve warheads?
Yeah, Kris, you hit on a really important point. And today, Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia Lab, as part of that tri-lab group, they have a coordinating activity underway to ensure that digital engineering skills and techniques and tools are used to predict exactly what you're talking about, how this weapon might come together. And there's a lot of exciting developments in this area. The Sandia has a lead for that for the NNSA complex, but all three labs are participating. It also extends to the production complex, such that Pantex in Texas, the Y-12 in Tennessee, are also involved in this effort to use the best engineering techniques through computer-aided design strategies to ensure that we optimize weapons performance.
Well, Roger, and as you mentioned, there are, of course, limits to what may be discussable with this, but let's talk a little bit in a general sense, if possible, Captain, about something like the B-61 Mod 12, which takes a variety of different nuclear weapons variants or bombs, consolidates them into one to give commanders a wider range of options. You have earth-penetrating area detonation. What are some of the adjustments to warheads that can impact that kind of decision-making and tactical equation, of course, in a general sense?
Yeah, at a high level, some of these warhead, I'll call them, there's four different kinds of modernization programs. There's life extensions, there's weapons modifications, there are alterations, there's acquisitions. The B-61-12 that you're mentioning has had activities conducted to enhance its accuracy of delivery of that warhead. And many of these are looking at more accurate delivery systems, fusing systems, radar enhancements, in some cases looking at using other materials for the construct of this warhead. I'll note that during the early stages of the atomic phase after World War II, some of the materials that were used in the 1950s and 60s had some environmental threats associated with them. There are threats both to the environment as well as to individuals working on those weapons. So there's been a lot of progress made in material science in these warhead extension programs to ensure that we're using the best weapon components capable of fulfilling the mission.
Excellent. Well, that calls to mind something like the Trident II D5 Life Extension Program, and now there's a Life Extension Program 2. What kinds of modifications can take place to enable this weapon to surge into the future and remain relevant and capable of countering defenses or achieving its intended effect?
In many cases, while the details are classified, I'd say that these are intended to have a more accurately delivered warhead. For instance, the current Trident-class submarine, the Ohio-class submarines, have 24 missile tubes. The replacement Columbia-class SSBN, and the first Columbia started construction in 2020, and is supposed to be operational, I believe, in 2031-2032 time period. That new SSBN, the Columbia-class, will only have 12 missile tubes. So the ability to have a more accurately delivered weapon in some cases can equate to having fewer missile requirements. And so the W-88 alteration that's underway for the Trident II D5 submarine-launched ballistic missile is being developed along those lines. A longer-term acquisition program that's relevant to this missile, Kris, is the W-93. It's a new warhead design, but it's based on previously demonstrated design, so it does not require nuclear testing, and that's to be the future warhead for the submarine-launched ballistic missile force.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence.
You called to mind something of great significance. You remind me when I was speaking with a GBSD, a senior Air Force weapons developer, who talked about reliability, that the next generation ICBM will have enhanced performance, target, trajectory, guidance systems, just in a general sense, as well as reliability. What does reliability mean, and how important is that when it comes to the future of nuclear weapons?
Oh, it's hugely important, Kris. And one of the strengths of the triad and the Air Force, Navy components of those, the Air Force has two of those legs. Obviously, the ICBM, current Minuteman III missiles, will be replaced by the Sentinel ICBM that you're referring to. Then you have the B-21 stealth bomber that's under design right now, and we're supposed to have around 100 of those eventually. The Air Force, for the ICBM side, does test all the time of missiles without an actual warhead to verify that the actual missile will go when launched. So that's a direct test of the warhead itself, of the missile itself, for reliability. Submarine does the same. Force does the same thing through the Strategic Systems Program Office to test out the D5 missile. Again, without a warhead being attached, it has a dummy in there, and those shots are done on an annual basis just to prove that those systems still have reliability that we need.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it calls to mind some of the other warhead technologies and the specifics that you've been working on. What about the W80-4 life extension? You mentioned life extensions. Some of them are legacy weapons that get modified to surge decades into the future. What is that warhead, and what's it aiming to accomplish?
Yeah, that's the Air Force launched standoff cruise missile, the W80-4. And that program is underway right as we speak, and it's meeting its milestones. But that's really for an air-launched cruise missile delivery system.
Is that LRSO?
That would be, yes, LRSO, that's correct.
Roger that. Well, that's an important weapon in terms of being able to hold some potential adversary at risk from beyond the sphere of air defenses in terms of an air-launched portion of the triad.
And exactly, and it's interesting, maybe about a little over a year and a half ago, there was a significant study done by what's called the Strategic Posture Commission, co-led by Senator John Kyle and former colleague of mine, Madeline Creedon, was with the Senate Armed Services Committee when I was with the HASC years ago. And that bipartisan committee validated the need to continue with the nuclear triad. So it validated the need to continue with the ICBMs and the Air Force bombers and the submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So I bring that up because I think there's been times in the past when some people say, well, why do we need to have this bomber leg, for instance? That's been revalidated by a high-level group just in the last year.
Excellent. This calls to mind testing. You mentioned firing with a dummy warhead. At one point, I wrote about how the B-61 Mod 12 was dropped from a B-2 for testing purposes. Of course, not with an active or live warhead, but number one, what do you test for? Number two, what can be learned? And how might this weapon, I guess with fire control and digital technology, be connected with a pilot crew to decide which variant might be needed for a particular situation?
Yeah, I think I'm going to simplify this just a bit. I'd say that airdropped B-6112, what is monitored in those tests is flight stability. Can it go actually land on the target that it's intended to land on? And so it's an accuracy of delivery, and that's probably the key component. Obviously, there's fins on the missile body itself or the bomb body itself that help steer it towards its final target. But those are all basic components that are tested in one of these non-warhead tests that you're talking about.
Interesting. How in the world does the technology work such that a single bomb can be adapted to either area penetration, area fuse, bunker buster type, larger yield, lower yield? How in the world can all of those contingencies or potential attack possibilities be built into a single weapon, and how in the world can it be determined which one should be optimal?
Well, not every weapon has complete applicability to all given targets. And so there are certain types of weapons you want to use against certain types of targets, but there's certain weapons you not want to use against a certain type of target. So I think you'll see, while some of them have multiple capabilities as far as what targets they can put at risk, there's a lot that goes into looking at our stockpile and the weapons in there to see what are the range of threats we face as a country, what are the weapons that other competitors, Russia and China, have, what is the yield, the nuclear explosive quantity of the weapon that we need to have a comparable proportional response, let's say, in a given attack. So, for instance, a few years back, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not there might be a Russian attempt to invade the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And what would a ground war by the Russian Federation look like in that part of the world? And this is all pre-Ukraine invasion. And many thought that there could be a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon potentially used by the Russian Federation to bring that kind of conflict to an end. Well, when that war scenario was being studied by war planners and war gamers, etc., it caused folks in the Department of Defense, the Nuclear Weapons Council, the White House to say, hey, do we have a comparable low-yield weapon comparable to what this low-yield tactical weapon that could be used by Russia would be? And the decision was needed to enhance our arsenal, and that led to the plans to modify the W-76 submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead to have a lower-yield option. Again, to have a spectrum of capabilities that would encompass all the threats we might face.
You anticipated my next thought, which was the SLCM. That got truncated, stopped, and has now been resurrected. Let's talk about the importance of that weapon as it pertains to the broader question of deterrence in terms of enabling a commander to have options.
Yeah. It's interesting because I carried the prior version of the sea-launched cruise missile and attack submarine I was on in 1990. So the submarine-launched cruise missile nuclear variant has been around for a while. When, again, at the end of the Cold War, early 1990s, those weapons were taken off of attack submarines. That's where I carried one, or carried some. And they were put in kind of reserve mode during around 2000, 2010 time period, in that 10-year block of time. Those weapons were basically taken out of the stockpile, and we didn't have any. And so there's a lot of controversy over this at many levels, but basically this SLCM-N is under an acquisition strategy right now to replace this weapon that we previously had. And again, it was in the stockpile and carried on submarines for many years, as many believed it to be an effective deterrent capability.
I want to ask you about a couple more warhead modernization programs. One of them is let's start with this, the B-6113. That seems to have an interesting purpose.
Yeah, the 6113 is designed to replace some of the B-61 Mod 7s that are currently in the stockpile. And the goal of that, I'll say at a high level, is to provide a greater capability against certain harder and large area military targets. And that program is underway. And so I think that's another example of a careful analysis by our war planners, our Department of Defense personnel, U.S. Strategic Command, to look at what the needs are and how do we adapt the stockpile to make sure we can fulfill those needs.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I wanted to ask about preserving the stockpile and some of the nuclear maintenance or preservation technologies. But before we go there, what about the W-93?
Yeah, that's one of the ones that I can't tell you much about it other than that it's intended to be a replacement for the submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads, which are currently the W-76 and the W-88. It's going to be designed to be consistent and compliant with previously tested designs, but it will not require any nuclear explosive testing to certify it for the stockpile. And that's supposed to be, I believe, around the mid-2030s, so it's a ways off. But those activities take a long time to develop, and so the initial planning for that is currently underway.
I'm really interested in your expertise on the Columbia. I remember when I first came across writing about Columbia, there was this life of core reactor issue where you don't have to dock or come back for midlife refueling. Extends deployment time means you can accomplish the same mission with a fewer number of submarines, etc. I'd love to call upon your expertise. A, what makes that possible? How do you do that? And essentially, what is that?
Yeah, so when I first went to sea on a submarine, that was back when I was in ensign in 1978. I got through the training pipeline on USS George Bancroft. At that time, submarines went through a refueling overhaul on the order about every 6 to 10 years, or something like that, so that the given submarine life of 30 years at that time, you'd see a submarine maybe have been refueled 3 times. And through the Naval Reactors Organization, which is part of the Department of Energy, a lot of scientific studies were conducted to see how might a new core for submarines be designed that would last a nominal 30 years, maybe even 40 years. And therefore, that would be a life of the ship core that would never require refueling, which takes usually about 2 years out of the service life of that ship in a shipyard someplace. So that's a significant achievement by the Naval Reactors Organization. and one that the Navy is very proud of. Today, the Virginia-class submarines, there's around 23 of those currently commissioned. I think another 8 or so are under construction. All of those are life of the ship cores. The Columbia-class will be the same type of life of the ship core.
Well, that seems extremely significant. Is that part of why instead of 14 Ohios, you need 12 Columbias?
That's part of it. Yes, I think you have the several factors. You have the availability of how many platforms. So if you have a submarine that does not require refueling, it's not being taken out every 5 or 6 years for a 2-year period to refuel it. So you have more availability of those Columbia-class platforms. Also, the enhanced accuracy of the submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead is another factor, I think, that weighs into the number of missile tubes and number of submarines in the Columbia-class.
And I wanted to ask about warhead modernization in this general sense. Obviously, I don't want to ask anything sensitive, but when it comes to finding its way through a target, along with decoys, going through countermeasures, the Space Force will talk a lot about redundancy, that's one way to ensure mission success, to have built-in redundancy. You have things like re-entry bodies, you have multiple warheads on a single launch vehicle, essentially. Is that being expanded, and doesn't it make sense to think of the broadest number of warheads possible that are still precision guided can finish on successfully to the intended target despite countermeasures?
Yeah, all I can say about that, because of classification concerns, is that a lot of study is done in this area, as you well imagine, and a lot of time is developed, expended on ensuring the modeling and simulation tools to verify that the RVs, reentry vehicles, will launch as intended and will end up, arriving at the desired target.
Roger that. How do you increase the yield, or how do you have a single weapon, and is this possible, that is both low yield and full yield, essentially?
Well, the current design is when the W-76 warhead was put into place during the first administration of President Trump, that was a very simple modification to the existing W-76-1 warhead that had a primary and a secondary. I'm going to leave it at that. It's a fairly simple step. Other warheads may have more complexity, but I can't really get into that in this form.
Roger that. Well, gosh, I could talk to you all day. Let me call upon your expertise, Captain, Navy Captain, former submariner. What are we missing here? What is the most cutting-edge element of nuclear modernization in terms of warhead preservation, warhead modernization, and S&T? And then let that remind me to pick up on the computing before we finish.
Yeah. So, Kris, at a high level, one of the key messages, and then again, I go back to the Strategic Posture Commission. I go back to my time on the staff of the House Armed Services Committee 20 years ago, my time in government at the NNSA as principal deputy. One of the key messages for the American public and for Congress is the need for long-term bipartisan commitment to modernization of the delivery platforms, the warheads, and the supporting infrastructure. One thing we have not yet talked about is a critical part of the NNSA mission, which is to develop plutonium pits. The pit is the central component of a nuclear weapon. It's basically a bowling ball-sized sphere that has the nuclear explosive package in it. During the Cold War, we were producing hundreds of those a year at Rocky Flats, a site in Colorado. That shut down in 1992. Today, we're producing a few pits. The goal is to get to 80 pits a year by maybe another 8 or 10 years from now. But to do that requires significant investment in infrastructure at both Los Alamos National Laboratory, their plutonium finishing buildings called PF4, as well as at the Savannah River site down in South Carolina. Those are the two locations for production of pits. The goal is to have Savannah River site produce 50 a year and Los Alamos 30 a year. But that takes a lot of money to build glove boxes, seismically qualified factory floors, et cetera, et cetera. And so that requires a long-term commitment by Congress to funding in the annual appropriations bill the funds to make those happen. There's other examples of that: uranium production facility at the Y-12 plant in Tennessee, some upgrades to the facilities at the Pantex plant in Texas. So recapitalizing that entire nuclear weapons ashore complex is really important.
I definitely want to pick up before we run out of time. We're probably nearing our time window, but you mentioned computer and computer processing speed. And I wanted to ask you about that, not just in terms of digital engineering and technology development, but integration on the weapons themselves, whether it's command and control, managing information. You could talk forever about AI. Of course, the Pentagon doctrine is still human must be in the loop, of course. But when it comes to fire control, different kinds of automated activities, to what extent can these faster computing speeds and things like AI-enabled systems change the equation?
Yeah, let me just make a comment, because I think it's hard sometimes. I'm not a computer scientist. Sometimes it's hard to put in perspective what this fast speed really is. And so I wanted to, for you and your viewers, tell you that this El Capitan supercomputer at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory basically can achieve 1.7 quintillion operations or calculations per second. What does that mean? Well, that is one person making one calculation per second for 54 billion years.
Wow, that's impossible.
So sometimes it's hard to even get our hands around or heads around, what does this mean? But so what that allows one to do is to go down to the neutron, proton, electron level inside the atom of uranium-235 or plutonium-239 and model at the individual level of those atomic components what is happening in this very, very fast fusion process in a nuclear weapon. So I think the ability to really scientifically study and understand the physics using supercomputers is a radical shift in where we were 40 years ago. And it's one that gives us great confidence that we really understand and know well how our weapons work.
And we could talk forever, and we have to have you back to talk about data aggregation, sensor filtering, and essentially AI-enabled real-time analytics to do threat discernment, because, of course, that's an entirely different equation now. Yeah. Something jumped to mind as you were talking, which is, don't the laboratories also work on non-nuclear components? I understand from just doing some research and reading on it, Sandia does a bunch of that. How do those integrate with the nuclear components, and where do those fit?
Great question. So you have the two nuclear explosive package laboratories are Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico and Lawrence Livermore in New Mexico. Sandia in Albuquerque, New Mexico, deals with non-nuclear components, such things as the firing, fusing, detonation system for a warhead, radars, neutron generators, which are part of the package. And in that process, Sandia is the lead systems integrator between Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore to bring all three of the lab bodies together to ensure that this all makes sense and will fit together and work as intended. So the integration piece is a very significant part of Sandia's mission.
Excellent. Well, Captain, former Navy submariner who's gone on to do so many things, we couldn't possibly list them all. Sir, your expertise is incredible, and it's just the kind of science and technology, data and insight that our listeners really want to hear. So I got to thank you for your time, sir. It's not to sound obsequious, but you know what? It's an honor to have you with all the things you've done and your expertise.
Thank you, Kris. It's my pleasure.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krunthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NuclearCast.